20 years. It's a lifetime, isn't it? Long enough to build an empire, raise a family, and create a history so intertwined with another person that you can't tell where you end and they begin. Our 20th anniversary party was meant to be a monument to that journey. The house, one I had designed myself, was filled with the warm glow of fairy lights and the laughter of friends and family. My wife, Sarah, was the center of it all, a radiant sun in a silver dress. But as I watched her move through the crowd, a chill I couldn't explain crept down my spine. It was the same unsettling feeling I'd been having for months, a quiet hum of wrongness beneath the surface of our perfect life. I just had no idea how right I was. For 20 years, I was a devoted husband and a successful architect, a man who built his family and his firm on a foundation of trust. You are about to hear the story of how that foundation was a lie, and watch, step by step, how I used the precision of my own craft to engineer the controlled demolition of the two people I trusted most in the world. Our life was the American dream, or so it appeared from the outside. We lived in a custom-built home in a manicured cul-de-sac, the kind of place where neighbors like the Hendersons knew your schedule better than you did. We had 2 great kids, both off at college, and a marriage that everyone pointed to as the gold standard. I was a partner at a successful architecture firm, and Sarah, after years of being a stay-at-home mom, had recently started a small but thriving interior design business, often collaborating on projects with my firm. It was a perfect synergy. Even my younger brother Mark worked for me. I'd given him a job as a project manager right out of college, helped him with the down payment on his house, and always had his back. He was family, after all. But I was about to learn that the deepest cuts often come from the hands you've held up your entire life. The cracks started subtly, so small I almost convinced myself they weren't there. It began with Sarah's newfound obsession with her book club, which always seemed to meet on the nights I had late meetings. Then there were the hushed phone calls she'd end abruptly the moment I walked into the room, always with a flustered excuse about a demanding client or her sister needing advice. The most jarring change was her sudden, intense interest in our finances. Sarah had never cared for the numbers, happily leaving the investments and accounts to me. Now she was asking pointed questions about asset allocation, liquidity, and the ownership structure of my firm. When I'd ask why the sudden curiosity, she would just laugh it off, saying she wanted to be a more empowered partner. It sounded reasonable, but her eyes never quite met mine. The feeling of unease solidified into a cold knot of dread one Tuesday afternoon. I came home early, hoping to surprise her, and found her on the patio, her back to me, whispering frantically into her phone. I heard snippets of "has to be clean," of "he can't suspect a thing," and "Mark is handling the transfer." The moment my shadow fell across the glass door, she spun around, her face pale with shock. She snapped the phone shut and forced a brilliant, brittle smile. "Oh, honey, you're home early," she'd chirped, claiming she was on the phone with her sister, hashing out details for a surprise party. It was a plausible lie, one I almost wanted to believe. But later that night, I called my sister-in-law to ask a casual question about the party. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before she told me she'd spent the entire day on a flight to a conference in Denver with her phone turned off. The blood in my veins turned to ice. My brother Mark wasn't helping matters. He'd always been a bit reckless with money, a charming screw-up I constantly bailed out. But suddenly, he was driving a new luxury car and wearing watches that cost more than his monthly salary. When I confronted him, he just clapped me on the shoulder with a wide grin, boasting about a killer investment in crypto that had finally paid off. He was evasive, deflecting my questions with a breezy confidence that felt completely out of character.
He also started avoiding me at the office, communicating through emails for things we used to discuss over coffee. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when our family lawyer, a man I'd known since childhood, called me about a minor update to our will. As we were about to hang up, he mentioned offhandedly, "By the way, Sarah called last week with some very specific hypotheticals about dissolving a partnership in a privately owned firm. I told her it was complex. Strange." Strange didn't even begin to cover it. A conspiracy was brewing, and I was the only one who couldn't see the storm gathering directly over my own home. The anniversary party was the surprise I had orchestrated, a slideshow I'd spent weeks putting together, a digital quilt of our 20 years. It started with our awkward college dates, moved through our wedding, the birth of our kids, family vacations and holidays. Laughter and sentimental ahs filled the room. Sarah stood beside me, her hand resting on my arm, but it felt cold and heavy. Then, a picture from our trip to Italy last spring flashed onto the screen. It was a candid shot I'd taken of our son laughing, but it wasn't our son that held my attention. In the background, perfectly captured in the reflection of a polished shop window, was Sarah. She was holding hands with a man, their fingers intertwined, their heads close together in an intimate moment of shared confidence. The man was my brother, Mark. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The laughter died, replaced by a suffocating silence. I could feel every eye in the room darting from the screen to Sarah, to Mark, and finally to me. Sarah's hand flew from my arm as if I were suddenly on fire, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Mark, standing near the bar, looked like a cornered animal, his new watch glinting under the lights like a mark of his betrayal. The Hendersons from next door were staring with their mouths agape, their usual nosiness replaced by genuine shock. My own parents looked utterly bewildered. The slideshow continued its cheerful, automated progression on the screen behind us, a cruel, mocking soundtrack to the complete and utter implosion of my world. The party was over.
My marriage was over. My life as I knew it was a lie. And as I stood there, utterly alone in a room full of people, I realized the affair was just the tip of the iceberg. The whispered phone calls, the financial inquiries, the sudden wealth. This wasn't just a betrayal of the heart. This was a calculated plot, and I was the target. What exactly had they been planning to take from me? The silence in the car on the way home was a physical thing. It was heavier than any argument, louder than any scream. I drove, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, my eyes fixed on the road but seeing nothing but the reflection in that shop window. Beside me, Sarah sat rigid, a statue carved from ice, her silver dress now looking like a suit of armor. The 20-minute drive felt like an eternity, each tick of the engine a hammer blow against the anvil of my shattered reality. The partygoers had dispersed in a flurry of hushed apologies and averted glances. The beautiful celebration turned into a wake. My parents had tried to speak to me, their faces etched with confusion and concern, but I couldn't form words. My brother, Mark, had simply vanished into the night. As I pulled into the driveway of the home I had designed, the home I had built for us, I knew I wasn't just parking a car. I was entering a war zone, and the enemy was sleeping in my bed. The carefully constructed facade of our life had not just cracked, it had been pulverized, leaving behind a field of debris I was only just beginning to comprehend. The life I thought I had, the loving wife, the loyal brother, the secure future, was a meticulously crafted illusion.
For how long had they been laughing at me behind my back? Every shared memory, every "I love you," every family dinner was now tainted, replaying in my mind as a dark comedy where I was the punchline. This wasn't a simple, sordid affair. The pieces were clicking together with terrifying clarity. Sarah's sudden financial literacy, Mark's unexplained wealth, the lawyer's cryptic warning. This was a coup. They weren't just trying to cuckold me, they were planning to gut me, to take everything I had built, professionally and personally. And as I walked through the front door into the oppressive quiet of my own home, a cold, hard resolve began to form in the pit of my stomach. They thought I was just a husband. They were about to discover I was an architect, and I knew how to tear things down just as well as I knew how to build them. The next few days were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Sarah moved into the guest room and we communicated through a chilling, transactional politeness. She acted as if I was the one who had committed an unforgivable sin by revealing her and my brother's treachery. "You humiliated us," she hissed at me one morning, her voice dripping with venom. "You always have to be the center of attention, don't you, David?" The sheer audacity of her gaslighting was breathtaking. She was trying to flip the script, to paint me as the villain for revealing her and my brother's treachery. Meanwhile, my phone was blowing up with calls and texts from my parents, demanding an explanation, wanting to mediate. They couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that their two sons are now mortal enemies, and they certainly couldn't fathom the depths of Mark's betrayal. Did they not understand what was happening here, or did they simply not want to see it?
My suspicions about their financial conspiracy only deepened. At the office, Mark was a ghost. He'd sent a company-wide email claiming a family emergency and was working remotely. It was a thinly veiled attempt to avoid facing me, but it also gave him unfettered access to our company servers from a distance. I started digging. Late one night, fueled by black coffee and a righteous fury, I went through our shared financials. That's when I noticed it. A series of small, regular transfers from our joint savings account to a new account I didn't recognize. They were cleverly disguised, labeled with vague descriptions like consultant fee or vendor payment. The total was staggering. Tens of thousands of dollars siphoned off over the past 6 months. Following the digital breadcrumbs, I discovered the account was registered to a shell LLC. An LLC created 3 months ago by my wife, Sarah. The whispers on the patio, the frantic phone calls, it was all coming into focus. They weren't just planning for a divorce. They were funding their new life with my money, bleeding me dry from the inside out. What other financial traps had they laid for me? The true extent of their plot, however, was revealed by a stroke of pure, dumb luck. Sarah had been so flustered after the party that she'd left her purse in my car. I was clearing it out when I felt something heavy in a side pocket. It was a second phone, a cheap, prepaid burner. My heart hammered against my ribs as I turned it on. There was no password. The screen lit up, revealing months of text messages, not just between Sarah and Mark, but a third person, a divorce attorney known for his ruthless, take-no-prisoners approach. The messages laid out their entire plan in sickening detail. Sarah was to provoke me into an emotional outburst, something she could use to file for a restraining order and get me kicked out of my own house. Mark, in the meantime, had been downloading proprietary architectural plans from my firm's server, planning to use them to start a rival company with Sarah as the lead designer, funded by the money they were stealing from me. They had a timeline. They were just weeks away from executing the final phase. They even had a name for their new venture, a cruel, final twist of the knife. Legacy Designs. They were going to steal my life's work and call it their own. A profound, chilling calm washed over me as I stood in my garage, the burner phone glowing in my hand. The grief, the shock, the anger, it all coalesced into a single point of diamond-hard clarity. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness. They had assumed I would crumble, that I would be an easy mark. They had used my trust and my love as weapons against me. Sarah's gaslighting wasn't just a defense mechanism, it was part of the strategy to make me the unstable, irrational one in the eyes of the law. Mark's avoidance wasn't cowardice, it was a tactical maneuver to continue his corporate espionage undetected. They weren't just cheaters. They were predators, and they had been hunting me for months.
Holding that phone was like holding their entire conspiracy in the palm of my hand. I had the proof. I had their playbook. And I knew exactly what to do. I would not get angry. I would not get loud. I would let them continue to believe their plan was working perfectly. I would let them walk further and further into the trap they had set for me. An architect knows that the most stable structures are built on the strongest foundations, and I was about to systematically, quietly, and completely demolish the foundation of their entire world, using their own blueprints to do it. The war had been declared, but they would never see the first strike coming. In architecture, the most critical phase of any project is the one nobody sees, the laying of the foundation. It's dirty, unglamorous work, but get it wrong, and the entire structure will collapse under its own weight. My new project was revenge, and I was about to pour the concrete. I started by becoming the man they expected me to be, broken. I walked around my own house like a ghost, my shoulders slumped, my eyes vacant. I let Sarah see me staring at old photo albums. I let her hear me sigh heavily in the dead of night. I played the part of the blindsided, heartbroken husband to perfection because I knew they were watching, waiting for me to lash out. An emotional explosion was what their strategy required, the proof Sarah's lawyer needed to paint me as unstable. I would give them nothing but the quiet, crumbling facade of a defeated man. It was the first and most important lie in a foundation of deceit I was building just for them. The house became a Cold War battleground of passive aggression and feigned civility, a stage for my performance. Sarah would leave brochures for divorce support groups on the kitchen counter, a cruel and condescending gesture. "I'm just worried about you, David," she'd say, her voice dripping with false concern. At the office, Mark's absence was a palpable void. He continued his charade of a family emergency, his emails to the team becoming more and more brazen, delegating tasks that were clearly meant to give him access to sensitive project files. My parents, caught in the middle and completely out of their depth, were becoming unwitting pawns. My mother would call me daily, her voice strained with tears, begging me to be the bigger man and talk to Mark, to forgive and forget for the sake of the family. They had no idea they were advocating for the architects of my ruin, and their pleas only strengthened my resolve. The world thought I was falling apart, but in the solitude of my study late at night, I was drawing up the blueprints for their destruction. My first move wasn't one of aggression, but of defense. I found Eleanor Vance. She wasn't the kind of lawyer who put her face on billboards. She was the kind the billboard lawyers feared. A woman in her late 60s with razor-sharp eyes and a reputation for dismantling narcissists and high-asset divorces. I sat in her mahogany-paneled office and laid everything out. The affair, the financial siphoning, and finally, the burner phone. I placed it on her desk and she scrolled through the text messages, her expression unreadable. After 10 minutes of complete silence, she looked up at me, a grim, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice like gravel, "they haven't just given you a sword. They've handed you the blueprints to their entire fortress, along with detailed instructions on where to place the explosives." For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just a divorce,
It was a counterintelligence operation, and I had just hired my spy master. Under Eleanor's guidance, the next steps were methodical and silent. She immediately filed a motion to freeze the joint accounts, but had it sealed by the judge so Sarah wouldn't be notified until we were ready to strike. The siphoning would stop, but they wouldn't know why their funds had suddenly dried up for a few crucial days. Then I turned my attention to my company. I brought in our IT security consultant, a quiet genius named Kenji, and under the protection of a signed NDA, I showed him a summary of Mark's actions. The betrayal I saw in Kenji's eyes was validating. He confirmed my fears. Mark had been accessing and downloading files from our server at an alarming rate, focusing on our most valuable intellectual property. But instead of just locking him out, we created a honeypot, a new, beautifully organized folder on the server named Legacy Concepts Final. Inside, we placed what looked like our most innovative and lucrative upcoming projects, but they were Trojan horses. Each design was subtly flawed, engineered to fail structural analysis, and every file was embedded with a digital watermark that was traceable, a permanent, invisible signature of theft. All we had to do was wait for the rat to take the bait. The call I had been dreading finally came. My mother, her voice thick with forced cheerfulness, insisted on a reconciliation dinner at their house. "Mark and Sarah will be there," she announced, as if it were a delightful surprise. "It's time to put this ugliness behind us and be a family again." It was a trap, a setup orchestrated by my brother and wife to manage my parents and gauge my emotional state. Against Eleanor's advice to avoid them entirely, I agreed. I needed to see their faces. I needed to look them in the eyes and feed their arrogance, to make them believe they were winning. The entire dinner was a surreal performance. Mark, oozing a new, smug confidence, talked about his exciting new business venture, never once mentioning it was built on my stolen work. Sarah sat beside him, nodding encouragingly, occasionally glancing at me with a look of pity that made my blood boil. They were a team, a united front of treachery, and my parents were their captive audience. I played my part. I looked beaten. I spoke in clipped, hesitant sentences about how confused I was, how I never saw this coming. When Mark patronizingly said, "I hope you can understand, David, this is just business," I simply nodded, a wounded look on my face. "I'm just trying to process everything," I mumbled, making sure my voice cracked just enough. I could see the triumphant glint in their eyes. They thought I was a pathetic fool, an emotional wreck they could easily roll over in court and in business. They believed I was too heartbroken to fight back, too mired in my grief to see what they were doing right in front of me. As I left my parents' house that night, they stood on the porch, Sarah's hand resting possessively on Mark's arm, a portrait of victory. They couldn't have been more wrong. The performance had been for them, a carefully constructed illusion to lull them into a state of absolute certainty. Driving home, the mask of the victim fell away, replaced by the cold, hard face of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The next morning, Kenji sent me a one-line email. He took the bait, download confirmed at 2:17 a.m. The trap was sprung. They had my stolen money, they had my stolen plans, and they had my family convinced I was the one falling apart. They thought they were laying the foundation for their new life. They had no idea they were standing on a sinkhole, and I was the architect who was about to trigger the collapse. The real work was about to begin. An architect's greatest tool isn't a pencil or a computer.
It's the ability to see the unseen, to understand the hidden stresses, the load-bearing points, and the inherent weaknesses in a structure. My marriage, my family, my business, they were all structures now, and I was seeing the fault lines with a terrifying new clarity. Sarah and Mark believed their conspiracy was a steel-framed fortress, but I could see it for what it was, a house of cards built on arrogance and greed. My job now was to find the one card that, if pulled, would bring the entire thing down. And I knew exactly which one it was: their reputation. In our small, affluent suburban world, perception wasn't just everything, it was the only thing, and I was about to become the architect of their social ruin, one carefully placed whisper at a time. My performance as the broken husband continued, but now with a subtle, strategic twist. I started venturing out, making appearances at the local coffee shop, the grocery store, the country club. I knew I was a subject of gossip. The Hendersons from next door and others from the party had surely spread the story of my public humiliation. Instead of hiding, I leaned into it. When people approached me with hesitant, pitying looks, I didn't get angry or defensive. I just gave them a sad, weary smile and a simple, devastatingly effective line. "I'm just so worried about Sarah. She hasn't been herself lately."
When they'd press for details, I'd sigh and shake my head. It's all happened so fast, this new business venture with Mark. She's poured all our savings into it. That's a lot of pressure. I hope she knows what she's doing. I was planting a seed. I wasn't the victim of an affair. I was the concerned, stable husband, worried about his wife's impulsive, financially reckless decisions. It was a subtle reframing, but in the echo chamber of our community, it was all that was needed to change the narrative. The next load-bearing wall I targeted was my firm. Mark was still working remotely, but his influence was waning. I called a senior partners meeting, a meeting I knew Mark would have to dial into. I didn't mention the theft. I didn't mention the affair. I took a much more insidious approach. I presented a new, ambitious project, a high-profile community arts center that would be a legacy project for our firm. I laid out the vision, the potential, and the challenges. Then I looked at the faces on the screen and in the room and said, with a heavy heart, "Unfortunately, given the recent instability and Mark's extended and vague absence, I don't feel confident we have the leadership on the project management side to execute this. We need all hands on deck, fully focused. So I'm recommending we put this on hold indefinitely." It was a masterstroke of corporate maneuvering. I had tied Mark's unprofessionalism directly to a loss of opportunity for everyone. My partners, smelling a threat to their bonuses, were instantly on my side. I could see the panic on Mark's face on the video call. He was being professionally neutered. His reputation among his colleagues, the very people he might try to poach for his new firm, was being systematically dismantled. He had no idea the real attack was yet to come. My campaign of whispers soon found its most valuable messenger, Brenda Henderson, our next-door neighbor. Brenda lived for gossip. It was her currency, her lifeblood. One Saturday, as I was dutifully mowing my lawn, she came over to the fence, her face a mask of practiced sympathy. "David, dear, how are you holding up?" she asked, her eyes hungry for details. I gave her the performance of a lifetime. I spoke about how confused I was, how Sarah had changed overnight, and then I dropped the payload. I said, "The worst part," I said, my voice cracking, "is the money. She's taken out a second mortgage on the house to fund this thing with Mark. I only found out when the bank called. I'm terrified we're going to lose everything." It was a complete lie, of course. Eleanor had made sure our assets were frozen and protected, but Brenda didn't know that. Her eyes widened. A second mortgage was a tangible, scandalous detail, the kind of juicy, disastrous information her social circle craved. I knew that by sundown, every influential woman in our town would have heard that Sarah Miller wasn't just an adulterer. She was a reckless, financially irresponsible woman who was bankrupting her family and driving her poor, stable husband to the brink.
The effects were immediate and glorious. Invitations Sarah had received for social events were politely rescinded. Friends she'd known for years suddenly stopped returning her calls. The narrative had shifted. She was no longer the empowered woman escaping a stale marriage. She was a flighty, unreliable liability. The whispers I had started were now a roaring chorus of judgment. I overheard a conversation at the club bar. "Can you believe it? She's throwing away that beautiful house on some fantasy project with her husband's brother." Sarah felt the chill. I saw it in the slump of her shoulders, the way she now avoided going to the places where she was once the center of attention. She and Mark had expected me to be the social pariah. They had severely underestimated my understanding of the architecture of our community and just how ruthlessly I was willing to exploit its weaknesses. The final piece of this phase was the most personal. I visited my parents. They were distraught, caught between their loyalty to both of their sons. I came to them not with anger, but with carefully curated proof of my concern. I showed them a doctored bank statement, a simple but convincing forgery showing a massive withdrawal from our savings. I showed them a letter, also forged, from a fictional investment advisor warning of the extreme risks of the venture Sarah and Mark were pursuing. "I'm not angry," I told them, my voice heavy with feigned sorrow. "I'm scared. I'm scared for them. They're in over their heads, and they won't listen to me." I was positioning myself as the responsible one, the protector of the family's stability, while they were the reckless children gambling away their future. It was a cruel manipulation, turning their parental instincts against their own son, but they had left me no choice. They wanted to believe in the path of least resistance, that this could all be smoothed over. I was showing them that the problem wasn't a simple affair. It was a 5-alarm financial fire, and Mark was holding the gasoline. As I drove away from my parents' house, leaving them in a state of confused panic, I felt a cold sense of satisfaction. The foundation of doubt was now set. In our community, at my firm, and within our own family, Sarah and Mark were no longer seen as a romantic couple starting a bold new life. They were becoming known as unstable, untrustworthy, and reckless. They had planned a swift, clean extraction of my life and my assets, but I had turned their escape route into a minefield of social and professional disgrace. They still held the stolen plans and the siphoned money, believing they were just a few weeks away from launching their new empire. They had no idea that I had already built a cage of public opinion around them, and the door was about to slam shut.
In structural engineering, failure rarely happens all at once. It begins with a single imperceptible stress fracture, a tiny weakness that spreads under pressure until the entire edifice groans, shudders, and finally collapses. I had applied the pressure. I had laid the foundation of doubt. Now, all I had to do was wait and listen for the first crack. It came not with a bang, but with the sterile digital silence of a declined transaction. A 6-figure wire transfer, the down payment on a sleek new office space for legacy designs, was rejected for insufficient funds. This was the moment their fantasy collided with the cold, hard reality I had engineered. They were about to learn that panic is a corrosive acid, and their trust in each other was about to dissolve to nothing. The initial fallout was a storm of frantic whispered phone calls from the guest room. I sat in my study, pretending to review blueprints, the picture of a man lost in his work, while the tremors of their crumbling world shook the floorboards beneath my feet. They were confused. Mark, the financial genius who had boasted about his crypto wins, couldn't explain it. Sarah, who had envisioned herself as the glamorous head of a new design empire, was rapidly descending into shrewish panic. They cycled through every possibility: a bank error, a cyber attack, a temporary hold. The one possibility they never considered was me. In their minds, I was the sad, pathetic husband, the emotional wreckage they had left in their wake. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they couldn't fathom the man they'd written off as a fool was the one quietly and methodically pulling the plug on their entire operation. Their financial stress was compounded by the professional walls closing in on Mark. He had arranged a critical meeting with a potential investor, a wealthy developer named Peterson, whom he intended to poach from my firm. Mark was going to present the legacy concepts, my sabotage plans, as his masterwork. But I had already made a move. I had a lunch meeting with a mutual friend, the head of the city's most respected structural engineering firm. I didn't mention Mark's theft. I simply framed it as concern. "I'm worried about my brother," I'd said, stirring my iced tea. "He's under a lot of strain and is rushing some revolutionary new designs to market. Between you and me, I have serious concerns about the integrity of his load-bearing calculations." It was a piece of professional poison, delivered with a worried smile. My friend, a man whose reputation was built on safety and precision, made a quiet call to Peterson. By the time Mark arrived for his presentation, Peterson's mind was already made up. The meeting was short and brutal. Peterson didn't just decline, he questioned Mark's professional judgment, leaving him humiliated and without a crucial source of funding. Meanwhile, the social exile I had orchestrated for Sarah was becoming absolute. The Hendersons' annual 4th of July barbecue was the pinnacle of our neighborhood's social calendar, a mandatory appearance for anyone who mattered. Desperate to project an image of success and normalcy, Sarah insisted that she and Mark attend.
It was a catastrophic miscalculation. I watched from my own deck as they walked onto the Hendersons' lawn, and a palpable chill fell over the crowd. Conversation stopped. People turned away. Brenda Henderson gave them a greeting so frosty it could have caused frostbite. They were lepers, a walking scandal that no one wanted to be associated with. My parents were there, and I saw the deep, burning shame on their faces as they watched their disgraced son and daughter-in-law stand awkwardly alone, holding paper plates of food they weren't eating. The whispers I had started had become a wall of social condemnation, and they were trapped on the wrong side of it. The inevitable explosion happened late that night. I was in the kitchen when they came storming in, their faces contorted with rage and humiliation. The dam of their mutual deception finally broke. "This is a disaster," Sarah shrieked, her voice thin and ragged. "The money is gone, Peterson thinks you're a joke, and we were just publicly humiliated by everyone we know. What is going on, Mark?" Mark, his confidence shattered, rounded on her. "Me! You're the one who had to parade us around that party like nothing was wrong. You're the one who pushed for the expensive office space. Maybe if you had kept a lower profile, we wouldn't be in this mess." The blame flew back and forth, a venomous volley of accusations. Their us-against-the-world partnership had curdled into a frantic, finger-pointing free-for-all. They weren't a team. They were two co-conspirators who were realizing with dawning horror that their perfect crime was falling apart at the seams. I let them burn themselves out. When their shouting finally subsided into ragged breaths, I stepped out of the shadows of the hallway,
my face a carefully constructed mask of weary concern. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The effect was instantaneous. They froze, their rage-filled faces slackening with shock and, for the first time, a flicker of shame. To be seen like this, bickering, failing, falling apart, by the man they had so thoroughly underestimated, was the ultimate humiliation. I had exposed them at the party, but this was different. This was them exposing themselves, revealing the ugly, rotting core of their alliance. I looked from Sarah's tear-streaked face to Mark's sullen, defeated glare. I wasn't the victim in the room anymore. I was the calm observer of their self-inflicted chaos. They had started a war based on the assumption of my weakness, never once considering the possibility of my strength. They thought the foundation of my life was easy to demolish, but they were the ones standing on unstable ground, and the cracks were spreading faster than they could have ever imagined. They still had no idea who was causing the earthquake, but they could no longer deny that the ground was shaking beneath their feet. And I knew this was only the beginning of their collapse.
In architecture, after the unseen work of the foundation and the framing, there comes a moment of truth, the unveiling of the blueprint. It's the point where all the abstract lines and calculations are presented as a concrete, undeniable plan. The seeds of doubt I had planted were sprouting beautifully, choking the life out of Sarah and Mark's conspiracy. Their finances were frozen, their social standing was in ruins, and their trust in each other was shattered. They were weakened, paranoid, and flailing. It was the perfect moment to transition from subtle whispers to hard, irrefutable evidence. It was time to show my hand, not to them, but to the people they had manipulated and used as pawns in their game, our parents. The family dinner was my mother's idea, another desperate attempt to force a reconciliation. She called it a summit, a neutral ground where we could all talk things through like adults. Sarah and Mark, desperate to regain some control over the narrative and stop the bleeding, eagerly agreed. They saw it as an opportunity to gaslight my parents one final time, to paint me as the unstable, vindictive husband who was sabotaging them out of spite. They walked into my parents' dining room with an air of beleaguered righteousness, ready to play the victims. They had no idea they weren't walking into a summit. They were walking into a deposition, and I had brought all the exhibits. I let them make their opening statements. Mark, his voice dripping with false sincerity, spoke of creative differences at the firm and my inability to accept that he wanted to forge his own path. Sarah, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin, lamented my emotional withdrawal and how she felt forced to seek companionship elsewhere. It was a pathetic, self-serving performance. My parents sat at the head of the table, their faces etched with a painful mix of hope and confusion, wanting so desperately to believe this could all be fixed. I listened patiently, my hands resting calmly on a thick manila envelope on my lap. I let them spin their entire web of lies, giving them enough rope to hang themselves 10 times over. When they finally finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. My father turned to me, his eyes pleading. "David, what do you have to say?" "I'm glad you asked," I said, my voice calm and even. I opened the envelope and slid the first document across the polished mahogany table to my father. It was a summary, prepared by Eleanor, of the court order freezing our joint assets, along with bank statements showing the systematic transfers Sarah had made to her shell LLC. "This is why Mark's investor pulled out and why your new office lease was denied," I said, looking directly at Sarah. "It has nothing to do with my spite. It's because you were caught stealing." The color drained from her face. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Before they could recover, I slid a second set of documents over. This time, it was a sworn affidavit from Kenji, our IT consultant, detailing the exact dates, times, and file names of the proprietary architectural plans Mark had downloaded from the company's server. I had highlighted the folder name Legacy Concepts Final. Mark looked at the papers as if they were a venomous snake, his jaw working silently.
"And that," I continued, my voice hardening, "is what you have been trying to sell to investors, isn't it, Mark? My work. My intellectual property. You weren't forging your own path. You were trying to pave it with things you stole from me." My father, a man who had built his own business from the ground up on principles of integrity and hard work, stared at his youngest son with a look of such profound disappointment it was like a physical blow. He didn't even look at the documents. He just looked at Mark, his silence a more damning indictment than any shout could ever be. Sarah started to stammer, trying to formulate a defense, but I wasn't finished. I saved the most potent weapon for last. I took out the burner phone. I didn't need to explain what it was. I simply turned it on, opened the text message thread between Sarah and her lawyer, and placed it in the middle of the table. "Please," I said to my mother, "read the messages from August 14th. The part where she discusses her plan to provoke me into an outburst so she can get a restraining order and have me removed from my own house." My mother picked up the phone, her hands trembling. She read the texts, her eyes widening in horror. She then scrolled up, reading more. She saw the casual cruelty, the cold calculations, the complete and utter lack of remorse. She saw the unvarnished truth of the woman her son had married and the man her other son had become. The dam of my parents' denial didn't just break, it was obliterated. My mother slowly placed the phone back on the table and looked at Sarah, not with anger, but with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Get out," she whispered, her voice shaking with a rage I had never heard from her before. "Both of you, get out of my house, now." The fight completely drained out of Sarah and Mark. They were exposed, their lies stripped bare under the harsh light of undeniable proof. There was no argument left to make, no one left to manipulate. They had lost their most important allies. Their last shield, the illusion of family support, was gone. They left without another word, a silent, shuffling retreat of the utterly defeated. As the front door clicked shut behind them, a profound silence settled over the dining room. It wasn't the silence of reconciliation. It was the silence of a funeral. My father finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with a grief that went beyond a simple marital dispute. He saw the full scope of the betrayal, not just against me, but against our entire family. "David, I am so sorry. We had no idea." The foundation of their lies was demolished. The blueprint of their conspiracy was unveiled for all to see. But this wasn't the final stage of construction. This was just the demolition of their fortress. My own project, my masterpiece of revenge, was still far from complete. Now that their support structures were gone, I could finally begin to target the pillars of their new life directly.
Demolition is a messy, chaotic business. But the final stage, the controlled implosion, is a thing of architectural beauty. It's a precise, calculated event where the structure's own weight is used against it, causing it to collapse neatly inward. With their family support gone and their conspiracy exposed, Sarah and Mark were a structurally unsound building, teetering on the verge of collapse. My whispers had been the wrecking ball, clearing away their external defenses. The evidence I presented was the seismic charge cracking their foundation. Now it was time to press the button and watch them fall. The time for subtlety was over. It was time to introduce them to the full, unyielding force of the law and the cold, hard consequences of their own actions. The first charge was detonated by Eleanor. She filed for divorce. But this wasn't a standard filing. It was a legal masterpiece of aggression, a document that read less like a petition and more like an indictment. It cited adultery and financial fraud, referencing Sarah's shell company and the illegal transfers in brutal detail. Attached to it was a motion for a forensic accounting of every penny that went into her LLC and a subpoena for all communications between her, Mark, and her divorce attorney. It was a declaration of war that left no room for negotiation. Simultaneously, my firm's lawyers served Mark with a cease and desist letter that was thick as a phone book. It outlined his corporate espionage, referenced Kenji's sworn affidavit, and demanded the immediate return of all stolen intellectual property. It also informed him that any attempt to use, sell, or reproduce the legacy concepts would be met with a lawsuit seeking damages in the millions. We had built a legal cage around their stolen dream, and the bars were made of iron. Stripped of their allies and now legally cornered, Sarah and Mark's retreat was swift and pathetic. With the joint account still frozen and their stolen funds now evidence in a legal case, they couldn't afford to stay in my house. I came home one evening to find the guest room empty. A few angry scuff marks on the walls, the only sign they had ever been there. I learned from Brenda Henderson, who had watched the entire sad spectacle from her kitchen window, that they had loaded their belongings into a small U-Haul and moved into a rundown apartment complex on the other side of town. A week later, I saw them at the grocery store. They were arguing in the cereal aisle, their designer clothes looking absurdly out of place under the harsh, fluorescent lights. Sarah, who once commanded a room with her effortless grace, looked haggard and worn. Mark, who had oozed a smug superiority, now looked like a hunted animal, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. They were no longer the power couple plotting a coup. They were just two miserable people trapped in a cheap apartment with the consequences of their greed.
The most crucial part of my plan, the Trojan horse, was still waiting to be deployed. Through a colleague, I learned that Mark, in a desperate attempt to generate some cash flow, had managed to sell one of the smaller designs from the Legacy Concepts folder, a plan for a small high-end guest house, to a local builder named Frank Russo. Russo was a small-time operator, eager to move up, and Mark had likely sold him the plans for a fraction of their supposed value. I felt a momentary pang of guilt for Russo, who was about to become collateral damage, but it passed. He was a casualty in a war he didn't know he was fighting. I made a quiet call to a friend in the city's permitting office, mentioned the project, and asked if he could keep an eye on it. I didn't ask him to do anything illegal, only to ensure that when the time came for the initial foundation and framing inspection, it happened by the book and without delay. I was not just setting a trap, I was ensuring the inspector would be there to spring it. The news came on a Tuesday morning. My contact at the city called. "You're not going to believe this, David," he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "The inspector was out at that Russo job. He failed it. And I don't mean he found a few minor issues. He said the load-bearing calculations were a joke. The whole design is fundamentally unsafe. He issued a stop work order on the spot." A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was done. The sabotaged plans, the digital time bomb I had planted on my own server, had detonated with spectacular precision. I took a drive out to the construction site later that day, and there it was, stapled to the half-finished frame, a large, bright red notice from the city. The words "Stop Work Order" were printed in a thick black font. Below it, the reasons were listed: gross structural deficiencies, violation of municipal building codes, unsafe design.
It was a public monument to my brother's incompetence and fraud. This wasn't just a professional setback for Mark. It was a character assassination. In the tight-knit world of local builders and developers, a stop work order for unsafe design is the equivalent of a death sentence. The news would spread like wildfire. No investor would touch him. No builder would buy his plans. No bank would finance his projects. He wasn't just a thief who had stolen blueprints. He was a charlatan whose work was a public danger. He had tried to build his legacy on my foundation, and I had ensured that foundation was made of sand. His entire professional future had just collapsed in on itself. As I sat in my car, looking at that beautiful, damning red notice, my phone buzzed. The caller ID was a number I didn't recognize. I answered. The voice on the other end was gravelly and furious. "Is this David Miller? My name is Frank Russo. Your brother, that son of a bitch, just destroyed my company with a set of garbage blueprints he sold me. My lawyer found your name listed as the original copyright holder on the metadata. You and I need to talk."
Because I'm about to sue him into oblivion, and I have a feeling you have some evidence that could help me. I leaned back in my seat, the cold satisfaction washing over me. The trap had not only sprung on my target, but it had also delivered me a new, highly motivated, and very angry ally. Mark and Sarah thought my revenge was a private, emotional war. They were about to discover it was a multi-front legal assault, and I had just recruited a new soldier for the cause. When a building implodes, the destruction isn't confined to its own footprint. There's a shockwave, a cloud of dust and debris that blankets everything nearby. My revenge had reached that critical stage. The structure of Sarah and Mark's conspiracy had collapsed, and now the ripple effect was spreading, choking out their air, burying them in the rubble of their own creation. The phone call from Frank Russo wasn't just a new alliance, it was the beginning of the public phase of their downfall. They had committed their crimes in the shadows, believing they were untouchable. They were about to learn that the consequences would be delivered in the harsh, unforgiving light of a public courtroom, and the even harsher court of public opinion. Their private betrayal was about to become a very public spectacle. My meeting with Frank Russo took place in his lawyer's grim, wood-paneled office. Frank was a man whose body seemed physically contorted by rage. His life's work, his small construction company, was on the brink of bankruptcy because of the stop work order. He had suppliers demanding payment, a half-finished structure he had to pay to demolish, and a reputation that was now linked to unsafe design. I played my role perfectly. The senior, respected architect, deeply concerned that his firm's good name had been tarnished by a rogue former employee. I provided Frank's lawyer with a carefully selected package of evidence, a copy of the cease and desist letter, a non-technical summary of Kenji's IT report, and the copyright registration for the original designs. I gave him everything he needed to prove Mark's theft and fraud, without ever mentioning the affair or the broader conspiracy. Frank's lawsuit was a separate, cleaner weapon, and I wanted it aimed squarely at the financial heart of their new life. Eleanor Vance, my legal spymaster, was magnificent. The moment Frank Russo's lawsuit against Mark was filed, she amended our divorce petition. She argued that Sarah, as a co-founder and partner in Legacy Designs, was not just a passive beneficiary, but an active participant in the fraudulent enterprise. Therefore, she was equally liable for the damages Russo was seeking. This legal maneuver was brilliant. It chained Sarah to Mark's professional sinking ship. Any hope she had of walking away with a settlement was now entangled in a nasty public business fraud lawsuit. The money they had stolen from me, which Eleanor's forensic accountants were now tracing with terrifying precision, would likely be devoured by legal fees and damages before Sarah ever saw a dime of it. They had betrayed me together. It was only fitting they should face financial ruin together. The professional fallout was a cascade. The story of the stop work order and the subsequent lawsuit became the talk of the town's construction and design community. Mark was officially radioactive. My firm issued a formal statement, drafted by our lawyers, clarifying that Mark Miller had not been an employee for several months and that the firm was not associated with the unsafe and fraudulent plans he had sold. It was a public disavowal, a corporate excommunication that slammed the door on any chance he had of ever working in this city again. I started getting calls from old colleagues, from developers, from engineers, all expressing their shock and offering their support. My calculated whispers had blossomed into a chorus of professional condemnation. Mark's name had become synonymous with incompetence and fraud. The social shunning was now complete and absolute. The few friends who had remained on the fence, perhaps thinking this was just a messy divorce, now ran for the hills. To be associated with Sarah and Mark was to be associated with scandal, lawsuits, and public disgrace. I saw Sarah one afternoon at a cafe. She was sitting alone, looking tired and small. She tried to catch the eye of a woman she'd known for a decade, a member of her old book club. The woman gave a tight, uncomfortable smile, turned her back, and became intensely interested in the pastry display. It was a small, quiet moment of social death, more brutal than any loud confrontation. Sarah was no longer a person. She was a ghost, haunting the places where she once belonged, completely and utterly alone. Cornered, broke, and friendless, Sarah finally did what all desperate manipulators do. She tried to rewrite the script. She showed up at my house one evening, unannounced. The confident, radiant woman from the anniversary party was gone, replaced by a thin, pale ghost wearing a mask of contrition. She stood on the porch of the house I had designed for us and began the performance of her life. The tears came first, followed by a torrent of excuses. She claimed Mark had poisoned her mind, that she was swept up in something she didn't understand, that she had made a terrible, foolish mistake. She appealed to our 20 years together, to the memory of the man she thought I was, begging me to have a heart and call off the lawyers. "We can settle this, David," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Just you and me. Let's not let them destroy everything we built." I let her finish. I watched the fake tears trace paths down her cheeks and listened to the carefully rehearsed lines tumble from her lips. When she was finally done, exhausted by her own performance, I didn't raise my voice at all. I didn't show any anger. I just looked at her, my expression as flat and cold as a slab of granite. "You didn't build any of this, Sarah," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute finality. "You were just a squatter. And you weren't manipulated. You were a co-architect. I saw your plans to get me kicked out of my own home. I read the texts." Her face faltered, the mask of the victim cracking.
Your problem, I continued, is that you think this is still a negotiation. You think your feelings matter. They don't. This is a controlled demolition. Frank Russo's lawsuit is going to strip you of every asset you have left, and my forensic accountants have a map to every single dollar you stole. I watched the last glimmer of hope die in her eyes, replaced by the flat, dull look of utter defeat. She finally understood. There was no way out. Her last weapon, her ability to manipulate, was useless against the cold, hard truth. She was completely, finally, and irrevocably beaten. I stepped back and closed the door, leaving her alone on the porch, a stranger on the outside of a life she had so carelessly thrown away. Every architectural project has a final inspection. It's the moment an impartial authority walks through the finished structure and confirms that every beam is secure, every joint is sound, and the entire edifice is built to code. The project of my revenge was nearing completion, and the final inspection was not going to be conducted by a city official, but by a judge in a family court and a mediator in a business lawsuit. There would be no more whispers, no more manipulations, no more lies. There would only be the cold, hard language of legal documents, sworn testimony, and the undeniable weight of the evidence I had so patiently assembled. The chaotic, emotional demolition was over. This was the final, quiet, and devastating accounting of the wreckage. The depositions were a study in disintegration. Sarah and Mark, who had once been a united front of clandestine whispers and shared glances, were now pointing fingers at each other under the harsh fluorescent lights of a lawyer's conference room. Eleanor and Frank Russo's lawyer worked in perfect concert, dismantling them piece by piece. Faced with bank records and server logs, Sarah's defense crumbled. She tried to paint herself as a victim, a woman emotionally manipulated by my brother, but under Eleanor's relentless, surgical questioning, the facade fell away, revealing the cold, calculating mind of a co-conspirator. Texts from the burner phone were read into the record, her own words convicting her of malice and intent. By the end of her deposition, she wasn't a sympathetic figure, she was a liar who had been caught. Mark's deposition was even more brutal. Frank Russo's lawyer, a man who clearly relished his role, made him walk through the timeline of his corporate espionage step by agonizing step. When confronted with the digitally watermarked, sabotaged plans from the honeypot folder, Mark had no defense. He couldn't claim it was a mistake or an accident. He had knowingly stolen proprietary designs and sold them as his own, and those designs were proven to be fundamentally flawed and dangerous. His professional life wasn't just over, it was being autopsied on a legal table for all to see. The final, killing blow came when he was asked under oath about the source of his seed money.
He was forced to admit that the funds for his new luxury car and his initial investments had come directly from the money Sarah had siphoned from our joint accounts. He had not only stolen my work, he had funded his betrayal with my money. Their stories didn't align. Their alliance was a memory. They were just two drowning people pulling each other further underwater. The final court dates were not dramatic, climactic scenes from a movie. They were quiet, bureaucratic, and utterly soul-crushing for them. Faced with the mountain of evidence, their lawyers advised them to settle. There would be no trial, no public spectacle, just the quiet signing of documents that codified their utter defeat. In the settlement for the Russo lawsuit, Mark and Sarah were found jointly liable. Every cent in their accounts, including the stolen funds now meticulously tracked by the forensic accountants, was liquidated to pay the damages. It wasn't enough, leaving them saddled with a crippling long-term debt to Frank Russo. Mark was also forced to sign a legally binding agreement never to work in architecture or a related field in the state again. A professional lifetime ban. My divorce from Sarah was finalized a week later. It was a simple, sterile affair in a mostly empty courtroom. The judge, having reviewed the evidence of her financial fraud, granted the divorce on my terms. I retained full ownership of the house, my firm, and my retirement accounts. Sarah was awarded nothing. No alimony, no assets, no stake in the business she'd tried to help steal. She walked away with her clothes, her car, and half of a crushing legal debt. Her signature on the divorce decree was the final, quiet nail in the coffin of the life she had torched. As she walked out of the courtroom, she didn't even look at me. Her face was a blank mask of exhaustion. The architect of my ruin was now architect of nothing. Her future, a barren, empty lot. The aftermath in my personal life was a strange, quiet rebuilding. My relationship with my parents was strained, but slowly healing. They were grappling with the shame and grief of what Mark had done, and they had apologized profusely for their initial blindness. It would take time, but the foundation was there. I found an unexpected sense of community with my colleagues at the firm. They had rallied around me,
their loyalty a balm on the wounds of my brother's betrayal. The nosy Hendersons next door now waved with a newfound respect, their gossip having been replaced by the undeniable facts of the legal outcomes. The social world that had once judged and whispered now saw me as I was, a man who had weathered an unimaginable storm and had come out the other side not broken, but stronger. One cool autumn evening, about a month after the divorce was final, I was sitting on my patio, the same patio where I had overheard Sarah's first whispered, treasonous phone call. The house was quiet. The silence was no longer heavy and oppressive. It was peaceful.
It was mine. I had spent months meticulously planning the demolition of my old life, and it had been a stunning success. But as I sat there, I realized that revenge, as satisfying as it had been, wasn't a structure you could live in. It was a tool you used to clear the site. The real work, the work of designing and building a new life, my own legacy design, was just beginning. And for the first time in a very long time, I looked at the empty space around me not with a sense of loss, but with the boundless optimism of an architect staring at a clean, empty blueprint, ready to build something new, something better, and something entirely my own. For months, my life had been a demolition site, a chaotic landscape of shattered trust, broken foundations, and the methodical, controlled explosions of a revenge well planned. I had been the architect of ruin, not just for them, but for the life I once knew. And in the deafening silence that followed their final, pathetic retreat from my world, a question began to echo. What do you build on a cleared lot? Revenge is a powerful motivator, a consuming fire that can forge you into a weapon. But once the war is over, you have to learn to put the weapon down. You have to learn to be an architect again, not of destruction, but of creation. And as I stood in the quiet of my own home, truly my own for the first time, I realized the final lesson they had inadvertently taught me was not about the nature of betrayal, but about the resilience of a man who finally understands what is truly worth building. The final pieces of their old life were swept away by the quiet, indifferent machinery of consequence. Mark and Sarah, chained together by the massive judgment debt from the Russo lawsuit, lasted less than 6 months. Their affair, born of greed and opportunity, could not survive the harsh realities of public disgrace and shared poverty. I heard through the grapevine, that same suburban network I had once weaponized, that their final breakup was a screaming match in the parking lot of their run-down apartment complex, a pathetic public spectacle that served as the epilogue to their grand conspiracy. Mark, banned from his profession and saddled with a debt he could never repay, packed his car and simply drove away, disappearing somewhere into the Midwest, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own ambition. He had tried to steal my legacy, and in the end, he had erased his own. Sarah's fate was, in a way, more poetic. Stripped from her social standing, her money, and her partner in crime, she was left with nothing but the consequences of her choices. She had to sell her car, give up the apartment, and I learned from my sister-in-law that she had moved back into her childhood bedroom in her parents' house. The glamorous, empowered designer who had looked down on my life as something to be plundered was now a 40-something woman living under her parents' roof, a cautionary tale whispered at the country club she could no longer afford. She had traded a custom-built life of respect and comfort for a prison of her own making. The life lesson was brutal and cold. When you try to burn down someone else's house, you often end up homeless, living in the ashes of your own arrogance. My own life began to take on a new shape. I took the legacy project my partners and I had discussed, the Community Arts Center, and poured all my energy into it. It was a project about creation, about community, about building something beautiful where there was once an empty space. It was a form of therapy, a way to channel my focus into something positive. I also started mending the fractured relationship with my parents. It was a slow, painful process. My father and I reconnected over the shared language of building things, of integrity. My mother's grief over what Mark had become was profound, but in time she began to see me not as one half of a broken set, but as a whole, resilient son. We didn't erase what happened, but we built a new, more honest foundation around the hole Mark had left behind. The final piece of my own resolution came unexpectedly. Eleanor Vance called me into her office to sign the last of the paperwork. After everything was done, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me with those razor-sharp eyes. "You know," she said, "in 30 years of doing this, I've seen a lot of people get revenge. For most, it's a hollow victory. They destroy the other person, but they poison themselves in the process. You didn't do that." I asked her what she meant. She said, matter-of-factly, "You were cold. You were methodical. You didn't lash out in anger. You used their own greed, their own arrogance, their own plans as the weapons against them. You let them demolish themselves. That wasn't just revenge, Mr. Miller. That was architecture." She was right. I hadn't just gotten even. I had taught them and myself a profound lesson. Their entire plan was built on a flawed premise, that I was weak, emotional, and predictable. They never once considered that the quiet, steady man who designed buildings for a living could apply the same principles of structure, stress, and demolition to their lives. I used their own weapons, deceit, financial maneuvering, and manipulation of reputation, and wielded them with the precision of a master builder. The revenge wasn't in their suffering. It was in the elegant, undeniable proof that I was not the man they thought I was. The life lesson they were forced to learn was simple and severe. Never underestimate the architect, because he knows, better than anyone, that the taller you build your house of cards, the more spectacular the collapse will be. My new life was the ultimate payoff, a structure built not on the ruins of my past, but on the solid ground of my own strength and resilience. And this time, I was the only one holding the blueprints.